every time you read in the newspaper, I don't know the Finland media at all, but every time they refer to the settlements as controversial, you should bring to them to their attention. That's factually untrue. They're not controversial at all. They're illegal. Every time the media refers to the West Bank as disputed territory, how many people have seen that language in the newspaper? Disputed. There's no dispute. Those are Palestinian territory. There's no dispute at all. Legally, those are occupied Palestinian territory. In any case, even for people who have been around just a brief period of time, you have to wonder what accounts for that seemingly endless eruption of conflicts called wars, armed conflicts, wars, between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Israel has a ready explanation, which many of its so-called supporters echo, namely, Israel only fights wars of self-defense, what it calls no-choice wars. And the second half of that familiar claim is, whenever a partner for peace extends its, we'll use his hands, Israel is always eager to grasp a hand extended in peace and to resolve whatever conflict happens to exist. That's the standard claim. Well, we're talking about a fairly substantial history of wars. At the bare minimum, the 1948 war, the 56 war, the 67 war, what's called the 68 to 70 War of Attrition, the 73 war, the 82 war, the first Intifada of 1987, the Israeli invasions of Lebanon in 1993 and 96, the second Intifada, and then the Israeli attacks on Lebanon in 2006, and then what happened in Gaza about a year ago. So it's a very long list. And obviously, time doesn't allow us to go through the record on each of those wars. But somebody did come to our rescue and enable us to do a shortcut, so you don't have to be in this room through eternity. And the billions of people watching this can get some rest. There's an Israeli historian, his name is Ze'ev Maoz, and he is a very distinguished academic. He headed one of Israel's main think tanks, the Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies at Tel Aviv University. And recently he wrote this very fat book. It's a huge volume. It's so thick that I try to bring it on the plane, and they say it's a lethal weapon, and you can't bring it on. There are many people on whose heads I'd like to drop it if I had an option. I'm speaking as a strict believer in Mahatma. And what he does in the book is quite interesting. It's not so much original research, even though there are chapters of original research, and he's a very smart guy. What he does is he says, I'm going to look at all the scholarship that's been written on each of these wars. I'm going to see what all the scholars have written, and I'm going to just synthesize it, present a picture of Israel's wars with its neighbors. The book is called In Defense of the Holy Land, Defense of the Holy Land. And I'm going to just look at what all scholars have written. And so he has a chapter on the 48 war, 56 war, 67, and so on and so forth. Even going through each of those syntheses would take us a long time. But it's worthwhile to listen to his conclusion at the end of the book, or nearly at the end of the book. So first on the question of how do these wars start? Israel claims self-defense. It had no choice. This is what Mr. Maoz concludes. Israel's war experience is a story of folly, recklessness, and self-made traps. Not one of Israel's wars, with a possible exception of the 1948 War of Independence, not one, was what Israel refers to as a war of necessity. They were all wars of choice or folly. None of them were wars of self-defense. None of them were wars of necessity, with a possible exception of 1948. What about the record on peace? Israelis say we're always extending our hands in peace. We love peace. Israelis love peace. Every general who writes a memoir, every ambassador who writes a memoir, every official who writes a memoir, it's always peace in the title. Destination peace, hope for peace, we love peace, 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 peace. If you ever enter Israel and peace and general in your computer, it'll implode, it'll blow up. Because they love peace. Fact. But then Mr. Maoz, he looks at the scholarship on the topic. He looks what serious scholars have found on the subject. And this is what he concludes. Israel's decision makers were as reluctant and risk-averse when it came to making peace as they were daring and trigger-happy when it came to making war. The official Israeli decision makers typically did not initiate peace overtures. Most of the peace initiatives in the Arab-Israeli conflict came either from the Arab world, from the international community, or from grassroots and informal channels. When Israel is willing to take risks for peace, they usually paid off. The Arabs generally showed a remarkable tendency for compliance with their treaty obligations. In quite a few cases, it was Israel, rather than the Arabs, that violated formal and informal agreements. Now, the Israelis say that. The Arabs, they like to say, never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity for peace. It's the famous line from Israel's very clever former foreign minister, Abba Eban. He was very clever, no question about it. In the UN General Assembly, the Arab delegations used to refer to him as a wordologist because of his very clever grasp and use of language. The only problem is that it has very little to do with reality. And actually, Mr. Eban was honest about these things. He said, the main challenge of a diplomat is to convince others of what you don't even believe yourself.